Shortly after 4 in the morning on June 6, 1944, an American paratrooper named Malcolm Brannen was standing in a farmyard in Normandy, trying to figure out where he was. He had jumped out of a C-47 transport plane hours earlier into a sky full of tracer fire and anti-aircraft bursts. His parachute had snagged in a tree. He had hung there for an hour in the dark, listening to gunfire he could not locate, before cutting himself free and crawling through hedgerows until he found a handful of other scattered paratroopers. There were about a dozen of them now, men from different sticks, different companies, most of whom had never spoken to each other before this night. They were lost. Their radios were gone. Their assembly points were somewhere in the blackness to the south, or the east, or nowhere at all. So Lieutenant Brannen, commanding officer of Headquarters Company, 3rd Battalion, 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division, did the only thing he could think of. He knocked on the door of a French farmhouse and asked for directions. The farm was called La Minoterie. It belonged to a family named Lagouche. It sat on a country road about 2 kilometers north of the village of Picauville, in the heart of the Cotentin Peninsula. And at that exact moment, while Brannen stood in the doorway trying to communicate with a frightened Norman farmer, the sound of a car engine cut through the pre-dawn stillness. A staff car was racing up the road toward them. Brannen stepped into the road and raised his hand. The car did not slow down. It accelerated. The paratroopers opened fire. The car swerved, riddled with bullets, and slammed into the stone wall of the farmhouse. A German officer was thrown from the wreck into the road. He was alive. He was shouting. The words, in broken English, were unmistakable. "Do not kill. Do not kill." But his hand was moving toward the Luger pistol on his belt. Brannen shouted back, "Stop! Stop!" The hand did not stop. It touched the grip of the pistol. Brannen fired. The German officer fell dead in the road beside his wrecked car. Brannen knelt beside the body. The dead man wore the field grey uniform of a senior German officer with the distinctive insignia of a general, the oak leaf pattern that American airborne troops had been specifically trained to recognize. Inside the officer's hat, printed in neat lettering, was a name, Generalleutnant Wilhelm Falley. Wilhelm Falley was born on September 25, 1897, in the city of Metz, which was then part of the German Empire. He had volunteered for the Imperial Army straight out of school in December of 1914, at the age of 17, and fought as a junior officer in the trenches of the First World War. He had stayed in the military through the Weimar Republic and the rise of the Third Reich, slowly climbing the ranks over 3 decades of professional soldiering. He had earned the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross in November of 1941 as commander of the 4th Infantry Regiment on the Eastern Front. He had been promoted to General Major in December of 1943 and to General Lieutenant on May 1, 1944. He had taken command of the 91st Division just 6 weeks before D-Day, on April 25th. He was 46 years old and had spent 30 years in uniform, and now he was dead on a dirt road in Normandy, killed by a man who had been hanging from a tree in the dark an hour earlier. Brannen had just killed the commanding general of the 91st Luftlande Infantry Division. Falley was the first German general to die on D-Day. And his division, the unit specifically positioned to destroy the American airborne landings in the Cotentin, had just lost its brain at the worst possible moment in the entire war. If this story moves you, a like helps it reach others who care about the men who fought on both sides that morning. And if you are new here, subscribe. Brannen did not know it yet, but the dead general in the road was not simply one unlucky officer caught in the wrong place. Falley's death was one fracture in a collapse that was spreading across the entire German chain of command in Normandy that morning. Across the Cotentin Peninsula and beyond, German command posts were empty. Headquarters phones were ringing with no one to answer them. Divisions were under attack, and the men who were supposed to lead them were not there. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the commander of Army Group B, and the single most important German officer responsible for repelling the invasion, was not in France. He was in Germany. He had driven home to Herlingen for his wife Lucy's 50th birthday, which fell on June 6th. Rommel had checked the weather reports before he left. The Luftwaffe's chief meteorologist had predicted gale-force winds and rough seas in the English Channel through mid-June. An invasion, Rommel concluded, was not coming this week. He was wrong. Adolf Hitler was asleep in his mountain retreat at the Berghof in Bavaria. The panzer divisions that Rommel had begged to position near the beaches, the 12th SS Panzer Division, Panzer Lehr, and others, had been held back in strategic reserve under the direct control of the High Command. They could not be released to counterattack without Hitler's personal permission, and no one at the High Command was willing to wake him. The most powerful armoured force in western France sat motionless through the most critical hours of the most critical day of the war, because one man was sleeping, and everyone around him was afraid to knock on his door. And then there was the war game. Generaloberst Friedrich Dollmann, commander of the German 7th Army responsible for defending Normandy, had scheduled a Kriegspiel, a map exercise, at the city of Rennes in Brittany. The Kriegspiel was a Prussian invention, a wargaming method dating back to the 1820s when Lieutenant Georg von Reiswitz had presented his tabletop war simulation to the Prussian court. The elder Moltke had endorsed it as a training tool, and for over a century, German officers had used map exercises to sharpen their decision-making and test their plans against simulated opposition. It was one of the great intellectual achievements of the German military tradition. The exercise Dollmann scheduled was to begin on June 6th. Its purpose, in a twist of irony so severe it almost defies belief, was to rehearse the German response to an Allied landing in Normandy. The scenario the officers would be gaming on paper that morning was, in its essential details, the scenario that was about to unfold in reality on the beaches and in the skies above them. To attend this exercise, corps commanders and division commanders from across the Cotentin and Brittany had left their headquarters and driven to Rennes on the night of June 5th. The very officers whose job it was to fight the invasion were 100 miles or more from their troops when the invasion began. Dollmann had been encouraged to schedule the exercise by the weather reports. The Luftwaffe's meteorologists had predicted rough seas and gale-force winds in the Channel through mid-June. The same weather that had made Rommel confident enough to leave for Germany had made Dollmann confident enough to summon his commanders to a training exercise. The Allied meteorologists, working with the same data, had spotted a brief window of tolerable conditions on June 6th. That gap between the German weather forecast and the Allied weather forecast cost the German army its command structure at the decisive hour. Wilhelm Falley was among those who had gone to Rennes. When the sky filled with transport aircraft and the first reports of parachute landings crackled across the radio nets, Falley had immediately ordered his driver, a corporal named Vogt, to race back to his headquarters at the Château de Bernaville near Picauville. His adjutant, Major Joachim Bartuzat, was in the car with him. They never made it. They ran into Malcolm Brannen at the Lagouche farm. Falley and Bartuzat were killed. Vogt was wounded and captured. The 91st Luftlande Division was now without its commanding general, without several of its senior staff officers who had also gone to Rennes, and facing the full weight of 2 American Airborne Divisions dropping directly onto its positions. The war diary of the German 7th Army, which was captured by the Allies at the Falaise Pocket in August of 1944 and later quoted extensively in the United States Army official history, Utah Beach to Cherbourg, recorded the mounting confusion of those first hours. At 1:30 in the morning, the first reports of paratroop landings reached 7th Army headquarters. By 400 hours, the staff estimated that the American plan seemed to be to tie off the Cotentin Peninsula at its narrowest point. But the reports were fragmentary and contradictory. The scattered nature of the American drops, which was a disaster from the American perspective, actually confused the Germans further, because it made the landings appear larger and more widespread than they were. The official history notes that the Germans appear to have been confused by the scattered drops, and that for some time they were unable to estimate the magnitude of the invasion. In consequence, reaction was slow and uncertain. Slow and uncertain. Those 3 words describe not just the 7th Army's response, but the response of the entire German command structure in Normandy on the morning of June 6th. And the 91st was not the only division paralysed that morning. Across the entire front, the German response to D-Day was crippled not by a lack of soldiers or weapons or courage, but by the absence of the men who were permitted to make decisions. And here is the question at the centre of this story, the question that makes Falley's death on that dark Norman road something more than a single unlucky encounter in the chaos of war. The German army had invented decentralized command. Over a century before D-Day, Prussian military theorists had developed a concept they called Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics. The idea was revolutionary. Instead of telling a subordinate exactly what to do and how to do it, you told him what you wanted to achieve and let him figure out how to get there. Trust the man on the ground. Give him the objective. Let him use his judgment. This philosophy had powered the Prussian victory over France in 1870. It had made the German army the most tactically flexible fighting force in Europe. It had driven the blitzkrieg victories in Poland, France, and the early campaigns in Russia. The German military tradition was built on the principle that initiative at every level of command was the key to victory. So how the army that invented initiative did paralyzed on the most important morning of the war, because its generals were at a meeting and its supreme leader was taking a nap? The answer to that question is what this story is really about, and the answer has nothing to do with tactics. It has to do with what happens to a system when the men at the top stop trusting the men below them. But before we get to that answer, we need to understand who the 91st Luftlande Division was. And we need to meet the one officer attached to that division who was exactly where he was supposed to be on the morning of June 6th. A man whose actions that day showed what the German system could still accomplish when it worked as designed. His name was Friedrich August Freiherr von der Heydte. He was a baron, a law professor, a devout Catholic, a veteran of the Battle of Crete, and the commanding officer of Fallschirmjager Regiment Six, the 6th Parachute Regiment, an elite unit of German paratroopers attached to the 91st Division. Remember his name, he will return. The 91st Luftlande Infantry Division was not what its name suggested. The word Luftland means air landing, and the division had been formed in January of 1944 at the Baumholder training area with the original intention of making it air transportable, capable of being flown into an airfield or drop zone as a follow-up force. But it never conducted an airborne operation, not once. By the time it was deployed to the Cotentin Peninsula in the spring of 1944, it was a conventional infantry division, and a poorly equipped one at that. Because it had been designed to be light enough to fly, it had been stripped of much of the transport and heavy weaponry that a normal German infantry division carried. Its artillery regiment used light mountain howitzers firing ammunition that was not interchangeable with standard German artillery shells, creating a logistical headache that would plague it throughout its brief existence. Its core fighting strength came from two grenadier regiments, Grenadier Regiment 1057 under Oberst Sylvester von Saldern and Grenadier Regiment 1058 under Oberst Kurt Beigang. Each regiment had 3 battalions. The division's troop quality was mixed. Some soldiers were experienced transfers from other formations. Others were undertrained recruits or Luftwaffe ground personnel who had been reclassified as infantry to fill the army's insatiable need for men. It was not an elite formation, but it had one elite unit attached to it, and that unit would do most of the fighting that mattered. Fallschirmjager Regiment Six, von der Heydte's paratroopers, had been formed in early 1944 at Cologne, from a mix of veteran paratrooper cadre and young Luftwaffe volunteers. The regiment had a combined strength of roughly 4,500 men by June 6th. The average age of its enlisted soldiers was 17.5 years old. A third of its officers and a fifth of its non-commissioned officers were combat veterans. The rest were boys who had never heard a shot fired in anger. Von der Heydte had been training them relentlessly since January, and he had turned them into a cohesive fighting force despite their youth. The regiment was deployed in a switch position between Montcastre and Carentan, covering the southern and central Cotentin, sitting directly in the path of the American 101st Airborne Division's drop zones. And here is the detail that matters. The Rennes war game was for division and corps commanders. Von der Heydte, a regimental commander, was not among those summoned. He stayed with his regiment. He was with his men when the sky filled with aircraft on the night of June 5th. He was at his command post when the first American Pathfinders hit the ground near Saint-Condumont. And because he was there, his regiment reacted faster and more effectively than any other German unit in the Cotentin that morning. This is the contrast that defines the entire story. 2 officers attached to the same division. One, the commanding general, was 100 miles away because the system had summoned him to a meeting. The other, a regimental commander, was at his post because his rank kept him where he belonged. One was dead before dawn. The other would fight for the next 2 months with a skill and tenacity that earned his paratroopers the nickname the Lions of Carentan from the very Americans they were fighting. The system had pulled Falley away. The system's own hierarchy had left von der Heydte in place. And that difference, The difference between a command structure that strips a division of its general at the critical hour and a regimental commander who remains at his post to fight is the fracture line that broke the German defense of the Cotentin. Now, let us see what happened to the 91st Division on the morning of June 6th, when that fracture line split wide open. At dawn on June 6th, with Falley dead on a farmhouse road and his headquarters staff scrambling to understand what was happening, the 91st Division attempted to launch the counterattack. It had been specifically positioned to deliver. The plan had been straightforward. If Allied airborne troops landed in the Cotentin, the 91st would attack toward the drop zones and destroy them before they could consolidate. Speed was everything. Hit the paratroopers while they were still scattered, still searching for their equipment bundles, still trying to find each other in the dark. Destroy them before they could organize. The plan required coordination. Grenadier Regiment 1058 would attack Sainte Mere Eglise from the north. Grenadier Regiment 1057, supported by tanks from Panzer Replacement and Training Battalion 100, would push from the west across the Merderet River. Von der Heydte's paratroopers would hold the southern approaches around Carentan and Saint-Côme-du-Mont. 3 prongs, converging on the scattered Americans, crushing them before the seaborne landings could link up. But coordination requires a coordinator, and the coordinator was lying dead beside a wrecked staff car at the Lagouche farm. What happened instead was piecemeal. The regiments attacked independently, on different timetables, without a unified hand directing them. Grenadier Regiment 1058 pushed toward Sainte Mere Eglise from the north and made initial progress, but the American 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment had already seized the town and was dug in. The German attack stalled against paratroopers who fought with the ferocity of men who knew there was no retreat and no resupply coming by road. Grenadier Regiment 1057's attack from the west ran into a different problem entirely. Elements of the 507th and 508th Parachute Infantry Regiments had seized the critical bridge and causeway at La Fière on the Merderet River. This bridge was the key to the entire western approach. If 1057 could cross it, the regiment could drive straight into the flank of the American airborne perimeter. If it could not, the western prong of the counterattack was dead. When 1057 tried to force the crossing, it sent forward 3 captured French light tanks, Renault 35s and Hotchkiss 39s, from Panzer Replacement and Training Battalion 100. These were obsolete vehicles, relics of the French army that the Germans had pressed into service for lack of anything better. They were small, thin-skinned, and slow. American paratroopers with bazookas were waiting at the far end of the causeway. The first tank was hit and knocked out on the narrow road. The second tried to push past and was hit as well. The third was destroyed in quick succession. All 3 burned on the causeway, blocking the crossing and turning what was supposed to be an armoured spearhead into a flaming roadblock. The infantry behind them could not advance. The attack collapsed at the river. Worse, American paratroopers who had landed behind 1057's assembly areas, men who had been dropped far from their own objectives by the same navigational errors that scattered the entire airborne force, now began attacking the regiment from the rear. 1057 found itself fighting in both directions simultaneously, squeezed between the Americans at La Fière in front and the lost paratroopers behind. With no division headquarters capable of sending reinforcements or sorting out the chaos, a regimental commander fighting alone can hold a position, but he cannot coordinate a divisional counterattack. That requires the general, and the general was dead. On June 7th, 1058 launched a renewed and fiercer counterattack towards Sainte Mere Eglise, this time supported by assault guns. The attack came close to breaking through, but American tanks from Charlie Company, 746th Tank Battalion, arrived just in time to blunt the assault, and the German attack was thrown back with heavy losses. The window had closed. The moment when a coordinated divisional counterattack might have overrun the scattered paratroopers and changed the course of the battle had passed. It had passed because the division had no general to coordinate the attack during the hours when coordination mattered most. Command succession did eventually occur. General Major Bernhard Klosterkemper, who had been commanding a regiment of the neighbouring 243rd Division, assumed interim command of the 91st from June 6th to June 10th. Generalleutnant Eugen Koenig then took over from June 10th onward. But by the time Koenig arrived, the operational moment was gone. The Americans had consolidated their airhead, linked up with the seaborne forces from Utah Beach, and begun the drive across the peninsula toward Cherbourg. The 91st would spend the rest of its existence being ground to pieces in a fighting retreat it was never equipped to survive. But the 91st's failure was only one symptom of a disease that was consuming the entire German command structure in Normandy. What happened to Falley on June 6th was the beginning of a pattern so devastating that it defies the laws of probability. Within 12 days of D-Day, 5 German generals in Normandy were dead. Falley was killed on June 6th. General d'Artillerie Erich Marx, the commander of the 84th Corps, was killed on June 12th. Marx deserves more than a passing mention because his death illustrates the German command dilemma with painful clarity. He was a one-legged officer, having lost his left leg to a Soviet shell during Operation Barbarossa in June of 1941. After almost a year of convalescence, most men in his position would have accepted a desk assignment and sat out the rest of the war in safety. Marx lobbied to return to the front. He was given command of the 84th Corps, responsible for the entire Cotentin Peninsula and the coastal sector that included both Utah and Omaha beaches. Marx was one of the few German generals who actually believed the invasion would come in Normandy rather than at the Pas de Calais. He had studied the coastline, war-gamed the scenarios, and positioned his forces as well as his limited resources allowed. D-Day fell on his 53rd birthday. When the landings began, he reacted faster than almost any other senior German commander, ordering counterattacks within hours, while other headquarters were still debating whether Normandy was a diversion. 6 days later, on the morning of June 12th, Marx left his headquarters for a routine inspection of forward positions near Heber-Crevon, northwest of Saint-Lô. The morning was foggy. He ordered his driver to take the staff car rather than a less conspicuous vehicle. When the fog lifted, Allied fighter bombers spotted the car on the road. A 20mm cannon shell severed the femoral artery in his remaining good leg. His driver, who was unhurt, pulled Marx into a roadside ditch to protect him from further strafing. There was nothing else he could do. Erich Marx, the most aggressive and foresighted corps commander in Normandy, bled to death in that ditch at 9:45 in the morning. He was buried at the German military cemetery at Marigny, where he shares a headstone with his longtime batman, Gefreiter Gebhard Eberhard. Marx died because he was at the front. He was at the front because the German command tradition demanded it. German officers led from the forward edge, personally observed the ground, and personally directed their units. This was the source of their tactical brilliance. It was also what killed them. The same tradition that put competent, decisive men where they could see the battlefield also put them where the battlefield could kill them. 2 days after Marx, on June 14th, Brigadeführer Fritz Witt, the 36-year-old commander of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, was killed when a Royal Navy bombardment struck his divisional command post at Venoix near Caen. Shrapnel hit him in the face. He died instantly. He was replaced by Kurt Meyer, who at 33 became one of the youngest divisional commanders in the German military. 3 days after Witt, on June 17th, Generalleutnant Heinz Helmich, commander of the 243rd Infantry Division, was killed in the Cotentin. 1 day after Helmich, on June 18th, Generalleutnant Rudolf Stegmann, commander of the 77th Infantry Division, was also killed. And on June 29th, Generaloberst Friedrich Dollmann, the 7th Army commander who had organized the Rennes war game that emptied the command posts on the night of the invasion, died. The official cause was listed as a heart attack, though some historians believe it may have been suicide, as Dollmann was facing the threat of a court-martial over the fall of Cherbourg. 5 generals killed and 1 dead under ambiguous circumstances, all within 23 days. The historian Robert Citino, writing for the National World War II Museum, noted that these men were all competent, hard-driving unit commanders, schooled in the operational art, trusted by their subordinate officers and men, and they were all gone. The British historian Milton Schulman, in his 1947 study of the German defeat in the West, calculated that across the entire 3-month Battle of Normandy, no fewer than 3 corps commanders and 20 divisional commanders were killed, captured, or wounded. The German officer corps in Normandy was being decapitated, and unlike the American system it was fighting against, the German system had no mechanism to regenerate what it lost. Now consider what this meant in practice. Every time a German general fell, the division he commanded experienced a period of confusion, while a successor was identified, briefed, and installed. Sometimes this took hours, sometimes it took days. During those hours and days, regiments fought on their own initiative, but the coordination between regiments, the ability to shift reserves from a quiet sector to a threatened one, the decision to counterattack or withdraw, those decisions stalled. They stalled because the German system concentrated those decisions in the commanding general and his immediate staff. When the general was gone, the staff could transmit information upward, but the authority to act on it had left with the dead man. The American divisions fighting opposite them did not have this problem, not because American generals were safer, although they generally stayed further from the front line than their German counterparts, but because the American system had built redundancy into every level of command. The assistant division commander could step in seamlessly. The chief of staff knew the commanding general's intent and could issue orders in his name. Regimental and battalion commanders had been trained to operate independently toward a common objective, not to wait for detailed instructions from above. The loss of an American general was a blow. The loss of a German general was a system failure. And here is where the deeper story begins. Because the obvious question, the one that anyone who studies this period must eventually ask, is this. If the German army invented Auftragstaktik, if the entire Prussian and German military tradition was built on the principle of decentralized initiative, how did it end up with a system so brittle that losing one general could paralyze a division at the decisive moment? The answer lies in a transformation that happened between 1933 and 1944, a transformation so gradual that many of the officers living through it did not fully understand what was being taken from them until it was gone. When Adolf Hitler came to power, the German officer corps was the most professionally independent military leadership caste in Europe. Its tradition of operational freedom, of trusting the man on the ground, of allowing commanders to deviate from orders when the situation demanded it, stretched back to Frederick the Great and had been formalized by the elder Moltke in the 1860s. A German division commander in 1939 had enormous latitude to fight his battle as he saw fit, provided he pursued the objective his superior had assigned. Hitler dismantled this tradition piece by piece. It did not happen overnight. It happened through a series of crises, each one giving Hitler a reason to tighten his grip, each one convincing him that his generals could not be trusted. The first major crack came in the winter of 1941, outside Moscow. When the German offensive stalled and temperatures dropped to -30°C, several German commanders ordered tactical withdrawals to more defensible positions. These were sound military decisions. The troops were freezing. The supply lines were stretched beyond endurance. Holding exposed positions served no tactical purpose and cost lives that could not be replaced. Under Auftragstaktik, the commanders on the ground should have had the authority to make these judgments. Hitler was furious. He did not see tactical withdrawals. He saw disobedience. He issued his infamous halt order, forbidding any retreat without his personal authorization. He believed, with some justification, that this order prevented a collapse similar to Napoleon's retreat from Moscow, but the cost was enormous. He relieved more than 30 generals in the weeks that followed, including the commander-in-chief of the army, General Feldmarschall Walter von Brauchitsch. Hitler then took personal command of the army himself. From that moment forward, the supreme commander of the German armed forces was also the operational commander of the army. The man who decided grand strategy was also the man who had to approve the movement of individual divisions. A division commander who wanted to reposition his troops to better ground could no longer make that decision himself. He had to request permission through a chain of command that ran all the way to a bunker in East Prussia. Each subsequent crisis deepened the centralization. After Stalingrad, where Hitler had forbidden Paulus's Sixth Army to break out of the encirclement when escape was still possible, he became even more suspicious of generals who wanted to retreat. After the fall of Tunisia, where 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered because they had been denied permission to evacuate, Hitler blamed his commanders, rather than his own insistence on reinforcing a hopeless position. After each disaster, the lesson he drew was not that he should trust his generals more, but that he should trust them less. By 1944, the principle of Auftragstaktik survived at the small unit level, where a platoon leader or company commander still exercised initiative in a firefight because Hitler could not possibly micromanage every squad. But at the operational level, at the level where divisions and corps made the decisions that determined whether battles were won or lost. Initiative had been strangled. The Panzer Reserve fiasco on D-Day was the purest expression of this strangulation. Armoured divisions that could have counterattacked the beaches within hours, the 12th SS Panzer Division, Panzer Lehr, and others, sat in their assembly areas waiting for permission from a man who was asleep 600 miles away. When his staff finally dared to wake him and present the situation, Hitler initially believed the Normandy landings were a feint and that the real invasion would come at the Pas de Calais. The panzers were not released until the afternoon. By then the Allies had put 150,000 men ashore. The only panzer division that counterattacked on D-Day was the 21st, which acted on its own initiative, pushed toward the beaches near Caen, and actually reached the coast before being driven back by British tanks and artillery, losing 70 of its 124 tanks in the process. A reserve army training document from 1944, uncovered by the military historian Marco Sig in his study of 3 German divisions, stated the philosophy bluntly. Deviation from the order, 5%. Adherence to it, 95%. That ratio would have horrified the elder Moltke. It would have baffled Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. It was the mathematical epitaph of Auftragstaktik. The system that had been built on trust had been rebuilt on obedience. And an army built on obedience needs its officers alive, because the men below them have been trained to wait for instructions. This is why Falley's death mattered so much. Not because he was irreplaceable as a tactical mind. Other officers could have directed the counterattack. But in a system where authority had been progressively concentrated upward, the commanding general was the one man whose word could set the entire division in motion. His regimental commanders could fight their individual battles. Oberst von Saldern could attack with 1057. Oberst Beigang could attack with 1058. But the decision to commit the reserve, to shift the axis of the counterattack, to call on the neighbouring division for support, those decisions required the general. And the general was dead on a road he should never have been on, returning from a meeting he should never have attended, because a system that no longer trusted its commanders to act without permission had summoned them all to rehearse a response to the very catastrophe that was unfolding without them. Now remember von der Heydte. Remember the man who stayed. While the 91st Division's headquarters struggled through the morning of June 6th without its general, von der Heydte was fighting. His Fallschirmjager Regiment Six had been the first German unit to identify the Allied airborne landings. His outposts near Saint-Come-du-Mont detected the American pathfinders of the 101st Airborne Division as they hit the ground. Von der Heydte ordered his battalions to their action stations and began engaging the scattered American paratroopers before the main drops had even finished. Over the following days, as the 91st Division's grenadier regiments were being chewed apart in the hedgerows and flooded fields around the Merderet, von der Heydte conducted a fighting withdrawal toward Carentan that was a masterpiece of small unit defensive tactics. He used the flooded marshland of the Douve River to channel the American advance into predictable corridors. He positioned his young paratroopers in blocking positions along the narrow causeways, where the Americans had to advance in column rather than on line, turning each causeway into a killing zone, where a few well-placed machine guns could stop an entire battalion. He rotated his companies through the forward positions to prevent exhaustion, and he personally moved between his battalions to maintain contact and adjust the defense. The terrain favored him. The lowlands around Carentan were flooded, and the roads ran along raised causeways that crossed the marshes in straight, exposed lines. An attacker on a causeway had nowhere to go. He could not flank the defenders because there was only water on either side. He could not call in tanks because the causeways were too narrow. He had to advance straight into the fire and take whatever the defenders chose to give him. When the American 101st Airborne finally launched its full assault on Carentan on June 10th through the 12th, von der Heydte's outnumbered paratroopers held the town in brutal house-to-house fighting until their ammunition was nearly exhausted. His 2nd Battalion, under Hauptmann Rolf Mager, fought through the streets block by block, contesting every intersection. His 3rd Battalion held positions on the southern approaches, preventing encirclement for as long as possible. Von der Heydte was everywhere, directing, encouraging, improvising, and doing exactly what a German commander was supposed to do under the Auftragstaktik tradition, using his judgment on the ground to fight the battle in front of him without waiting for direction from above. On the evening of June 12th, von der Heydte, recognizing that further defense would result in the annihilation of his regiment for no strategic gain, ordered a withdrawal south of Carentan under cover of darkness. It was exactly the kind of decision that the old Prussian tradition empowered a field commander to make, a decision based on the reality on the ground, rather than a directive from headquarters. The American paratroopers who had fought against him acknowledged his skill. They called his men the Lions of Carentan, a mark of respect from one airborne force to another that has endured in the histories of both armies to this day. Von der Heydte's performance proved something important. It proved that the German military tradition, when its leaders were present and empowered, was still capable of extraordinary tactical excellence. The problem was not the quality of the officers. The problem was a system that had pulled them away from their commands and stripped them of the authority to act without permission from above. The 91st Division did not survive the summer. As the American 7th Corps drove west across the Cotentin Peninsula, the division was pushed into an ever-tightening pocket. The fighting was relentless. American infantry, now reinforced by armor and artillery from the seaborne landings, ground forward through the hedgerows field by field, each one costing casualties on both sides. But the Americans could replace their losses. The 91st could not. Every killed or wounded grenadier was a man who would not be replaced. Every destroyed gun was a gun that would not be restored. When the Americans reached Barneville, around June 17th and 18th, the peninsula was cut from coast to coast. The German forces north of the line, including much of the 91st, were sealed off and pushed toward Cherbourg. Hitler, true to the pattern that had strangled his army's flexibility, declared Cherbourg a fortress and ordered it held to the last man. Generalleutnant Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben, commanding the fortress garrison, knew the order was a death sentence for the troops under his command. He fought as long as he could. He surrendered Cherbourg on June 26th. Thousands of the 91st soldiers went into captivity with him. The remnants of the division that had not been trapped in the Cherbourg pocket continued fighting south of the cut-off line, but they were a shadow of what had stood ready in the Cotentin 6 weeks before. By July 10th, the division's frontline infantry strength had been reduced to roughly 700 men out of a division that had fielded thousands. Total losses from D-Day to July 11th exceeded 8,000. The formation was reduced to a Kampfgruppe, a battle group in name only, and attached to other divisions for what remained of the Normandy campaign. On August 10th, 1944, the 91st Luftlande Infantry Division was formally dissolved. It had existed for less than 7 months. Its remnants were later used to help reconstitute the 344th Infantry Division, a formation that most of the 91st's original soldiers would never see because they were dead, wounded, or sitting behind barbed wire in prisoner of war camps in England and America. The 91st's destruction was part of a catastrophe that consumed the entire German defensive force in Normandy. But what made the 91st's story distinct, what sets it apart from the other divisions ground up in the hedgerows and the breakout fighting, was the specific nature of its failure. The 91st did not fail because its soldiers would not fight. They fought hard, sometimes ferociously, particularly von der Heydte's paratroopers at Carentan and the grenadiers at La Fière and Sainte Mere Eglise. Individual German soldiers and small units performed with the courage and tactical skill that had always characterized the Wehrmacht at its best. The 91st failed because it could not coordinate. It could not bring its 3 combat elements, 1057, 1058, and Fallschirmjager Regiment Six, together into a single concentrated blow, at the moment when concentration was the only thing that could have worked. Each regiment fought its own battle, on its own timetable, against a different slice of the American perimeter. 1058 attacked from the north, 1057 attacked from the west. Von der Heydte's paratroopers held the south, 3 separate fights instead of 1 coordinated assault. The Americans, despite being scattered and outnumbered in many local engagements, were able to deal with each prong in sequence because the prongs never converged. The division could not deliver the one thing its position and its mission demanded, a rapid, unified counterattack against the American airborne landings in the first hours of D-Day. And it could not deliver that counterattack because its commanding general never reached his headquarters. The Rennes wargame had removed the one man capable of unifying the response, and the system that summoned him there had no fallback for what happened when he did not come back. There is a final chapter to this story, and it belongs to von der Heydte, because his fate after Normandy contains the cruelest irony of the entire war. After the fighting in the Cotentin, von der Heydte's battered regiment was pulled into the hedgerow fighting of the Bocage, where it continued to resist with diminishing numbers through July and into August. On July 22nd, roughly 30 of his paratroopers conducted a daring raid at Saint-Germain-sur-Sèvre against an entire American battalion of the 358th Regiment, 90th Infantry Division, capturing over 200 men, including several officers. Oberfeldwebel Alexander Uhlig, who led the raid, was awarded the Knight's Cross. It was one of the most audacious German small unit actions of the entire Normandy campaign, and it came from the regiment attached to a division that had been officially dissolved. Von der Heydte survived Normandy. He survived the retreat across France. And then, in December of 1944, the system that had failed him at Normandy reached out and failed him one final time. For the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, von der Heydte was ordered to lead Operation Stosse, the last German parachute operation of the war. The mission was to drop behind American lines in the high fens of Belgium and seize a critical road junction to support the advance of the 6th SS Panzer Army. Von der Heydte met personally with General Feldmarschall Walter Model to discuss the operation and told him directly that he gave it less than a 10% chance of success. He was overruled. He was not given his own veteran regiment, the men he had trained and fought beside across Normandy. Instead, he was given a scratch force of about 1,200 men, assembled by ordering each battalion across the 1st Parachute Army to contribute 100 soldiers. Instead of sending their best men as ordered, the battalion commanders sent their misfits, their disciplinary problems, their least capable troops. Von der Heydte received men he had never met, men who had never trained together, and men who in some cases had never made a parachute jump. He had 8 days to prepare an airborne operation with a force that existed only on paper. The parallel to D-Day was devastating. At Normandy, the system had pulled the commanders away from their men. Now, at the Bulge, the system was pulling the men away from their commanders and giving a seasoned leader an army of strangers. The drop on the early morning of December 17th was a catastrophe beyond anything von der Heydte had feared. Of the 112 transport aircraft that took off, fewer than a dozen found the correct drop zone. The pilots, many of them inexperienced transport crews rather than trained airborne pilots, lost their bearings in the darkness. One rifle company was dropped behind the German lines, 50 kilometers from the objective. The signals platoon, carrying the unit's only radios, landed in front of the German positions near Monschau, 50 kilometers from von der Heydte. Ground winds at the drop zone exceeded 36 miles per hour, more than double the safe limit for German parachute operations. The casualty rate from the jump alone was over 10%. Some of the paratroopers who died on landing were not found until the spring thaw months later. German soldiers who participated in the operation were so bitter about the lack of preparation and the unnecessary casualties that an article in the German military newspaper Nachrichten für die Truppe, the equivalent of the American Stars and Stripes, ran a piece entitled Operation Mass Murder. By dawn, von der Heydte had gathered roughly 150 men. No heavy weapons, almost no ammunition, no radio contact with anyone. He was 8 miles from the nearest German ground forces with no way to reach them. For several days, he held his tiny band together in the frozen forest, sending out reconnaissance patrols that mostly never returned, waiting for a relief force that was never coming because the 6th Panzer Army's advance had stalled north of Elsenborn Ridge. When it became clear that no link-up would occur, he split his remaining men into small groups and ordered them to try to make their way back to German lines on their own. On December 23, 1944, Friedrich von der Heydte, the Baron, the Professor, the Lion of Carentan, the man who had been exactly where he needed to be on D-Day morning, surrendered to the Americans. He was 37 years old. The same system that had emptied the command posts on the night of the invasion had, 6 months later, sent one of its best commanders on a mission he knew was hopeless, with men he had never trained, into a sky his pilots could not navigate, to seize an objective no one could reach. It was Auftragstaktik's ghost, the form of initiative without the substance. A leader given a mission, but denied the resources, the authority, and the trust to accomplish it. The mission was technically given, but the system behind it was broken beyond repair. Von der Heydte survived the prisoner of war camps. He returned to Germany after the war and resumed his academic career. He became a professor of international law at the University of Würzburg and later joined the West German Bundeswehr as a reservist, eventually reaching the rank of brigadier general. He died in 1994 at the age of 87. He had outlived the war by almost exactly 50 years. Malcolm Brannen, the paratrooper who killed Generalleutnant Wilhelm Falley on a dark road near Picauville, also survived the war. He went home and became the manager of the hospital store at a hospital in Greenville, South Carolina. He lived quietly. He rarely spoke about what had happened at the Lagouche farm. He died in 1999 at the age of 88 in Hendersonville, North Carolina. He was later reburied at Arlington National Cemetery. Falley and his adjutant Bartuzat lay at the Lagouche farm for several days after the shooting. No one came for them. The German High Command did not immediately realize their general was dead. Eventually, 2 passing German soldiers had local civilians help carry the bodies to the grounds of the Château de Berneville, Falley's own headquarters, for temporary burial. After the war, both men were reinterred at the German military cemetery at Orglandes, in the Cotentin. Falley rests in Block 10, Row 2, Grave 207. He was 46 years old. The Orglandes cemetery holds more than 10,000 German soldiers who died in the fighting for the Cotentin Peninsula and the Normandy beaches. Most of them were young men, privates and corporals, whose names appear on flat stone markers set into the grass in rows that stretch across a hillside overlooking the Norman countryside. Falley is among them. A general buried beside the men he was supposed to lead, in a place he never reached on the morning it mattered. The story of the 91st Luftlande Division is not a story about one unlucky general killed in an ambush at dawn. It is a story about what happens when a system designed for trust is rebuilt for control. The Prussian tradition that created Auftragstaktik understood that war is chaos, that plans dissolve on contact with the enemy, and that the only way to win in chaos is to put thinking, empowered leaders at every level, and trust them to act. That tradition won battles across 2 centuries, but by 1944 it had been hollowed out from above. Hitler's insistence on centralized control, his refusal to trust his generals, his demand that decisions flow through him rather than from the men on the ground, turned the most tactically flexible army in Europe into a machine that could not function when its senior officers were removed. The Americans who fought in the Cotentin, the paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st, faced their own chaos on the night of June 5th. They were scattered across the countryside, far from their drop zones, in units so scrambled that sergeants were leading men they had never met from companies they had never heard of. The 82nd Airborne's 3 regiments were supposed to land in concentrated drop zones near Sainte Mere Eglise and the Merderet River crossings. Instead, navigational errors and anti-aircraft fire spread them across an area of roughly 10 by 20 miles. Some sticks landed in flooded marshes and drowned before they could get free of their parachutes. Others landed in the middle of German positions and were killed or captured within minutes. Radio equipment was lost, heavy weapons sank into swamps, and the carefully rehearsed assembly plan disintegrated before the first man was on the ground for 5 minutes. But the American system had been designed to operate in exactly that condition. Its sergeants had been trained to take command, assess the ground, organize whoever was nearby regardless of unit or rank, and move toward the objective without waiting for orders from above. The American system assumed that the plan would fail and built leaders who could make new plans from the wreckage. Where a German unit that lost its commander might hold its position and fight defensively until new orders arrived, American squads and platoons that lost their officers continued to attack, continued to maneuver, continued to seize objectives that no surviving officer had ordered them to take. The bridges at La Fière were seized by paratroopers from multiple units who had never trained together, organized on the spot by whichever sergeant or lieutenant happened to be present. This was the asymmetry that decided the battle for the Cotentin. Both sides faced chaos, both sides lost leaders, but the American chaos produced improvisation, the German chaos produced paralysis. The German system assumed the plan would work if executed correctly, and it built leaders who were superb at execution but increasingly prohibited from improvisation. Falley was not a bad general. He was a career officer who had earned the Knight's Cross on the Eastern Front and had been given command of a division at a critical moment. Had he been at his headquarters on the morning of June 6th, The 91st's counterattack might have been coordinated, might have been delivered with enough speed and weight to overrun the scattered American paratroopers before they consolidated. It might have changed the battle for the Cotentin. We cannot know. What we can know is that the system that should have put him at his command post instead put him on a road at 4 a.m, racing back from a war game that rehearsed the very disaster unfolding in real time. And the system that should have ensured his division could function without him for a few critical hours had, by 1944, been so thoroughly stripped of distributed authority that it could not. German soldiers who fought in Normandy and survived the war often remarked afterward on the same unsettling observation. The Americans did not seem to need their officers. The 91st Luftlande Division, in its brief and violent existence, proved the other half of that observation. It proved that by 1944, the German army needed its officers desperately, not because its soldiers could not fight without them, but because the system no longer allowed them to. That is what the 91st Luftlande Division reported after losing its general on D-Day. It reported failed counterattacks that arrived too late and hit too weakly. It reported regiments fighting without coordination. It reported a chain of command that could not reassemble itself fast enough to matter. And buried beneath those reports, in the space between the lines, it reported the cost of a military tradition that had been turned against itself, an army that had invented initiative and then made initiative a crime. Falley lies at Orglandes. Brannen lies at Arlington. Von der Heydte lies in a cemetery in Germany, having outlived both of them by decades. The farm at La Minoterie still stands near Picauville. The wall that Falley's car struck has been repaired. The road looks the same as it did that morning. Quiet, narrow, ordinary, the kind of road where nothing important should ever happen. But on that road, at dawn on June 6th, 1944, a paratrooper who was exactly where chaos had dropped him killed a general who was exactly where a failing system had sent him. And in that single moment, everything the German army had built and everything it had lost collided in the dark. Thank you for spending these minutes with these men. If this story reached you, a like is the single best way to help it find others who care about this history. If you are not subscribed, now is a good time. And the bell ensures you never miss one of these. I would love to hear where you are watching from today. And if someone in your family served in the Second World War, on any side, in any theatre, tell me about them in the comments. Their stories deserve to be heard. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.